So let's go ahead and take a look at current location data, the function. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a bit here. So here's the function, current location data, and it takes one parameter called key, which we're setting as a default to empty. In this first line, we use a function called getLocationData, which is this function right here, and we pass it the value of the session location. We then save this into the location data variable. Now let's go ahead and look at what getLocationData does. You can see because this is blue, this is an entirely new function again. This takes one parameter, which is location. You saw already an example where we passed the session location, which we know from our previous examples is a single word like garden or pond. Our first line of code creates a locations variable and makes it static. Again, so any changes that we make to this variable get passed from one function call to another. The comment line here mentions that the reason why we're doing this is because we're actually going to load some data from an external file for this location. But the next time we call getLocationData for this specific location, we don't want to go and get that file again if we don't have to. So what we're doing is creating a static variable so we can save the data into that variable so we don't have to go and fetch it again every time. The change in performance will be small enough so that you won't see it, but in general, it's good practice to take any place where you're performing an expensive task, and by expensive I mean it takes a lot of resources on the server, and save any results you get from that so you can use it later without having to do that process over again. Another word for this is caching, and as you begin to understand more about content management systems, you'll see how caching is used on various levels in order to improve performance. So once we've established our locations variable, what we're going to do is see if we've gotten the data already and stored it into our locations variable. So we're going to check to see if there's a key of the location that we passed here inside of the locations variable already. If there's not, which will return true for this negative is set here, we're going to go ahead and include the file in the locations folder called the name of the location.inc. So for pond, it would be pond.inc. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's inside one of those inc files. So I'm going to jump back to the example folder here, and let's go ahead and open up pond.inc, which is in the locations folder. So you see here that we're running some PHP, and we have a single array that we're adding two pieces to. The first is the description, and the second is a list of commands. Now there's a couple of interesting things to note here. First of all, by storing this data inside of its own file, what we've been able to do is remove one layer of the array. In our previous file, if we go ahead and look at the test.php file and move down to the place where we're looking at the data for a particular location, you see that we have our data array and then our pond key, and then within this key, we have another array. Whereas in our pond.inc file, we've removed one array. So instead of saying data pond description, we just have data description. So that will make our code a little bit easier to use. Another thing that will make it easier is that we've isolated the data associated with the pond into a single file that's really limited in what it does. In this file, we just have an array. We don't have any functions. We don't have any procedural code. And so when it comes to editing this file, if you have somebody you're working with, for example, who's going to be creating new places and adding data to those places, it'll be a lot easier for them to work with this and know that they're making modifications in the right place. So now if we go back to the code that we were looking at inside of our file comparison utility, we were looking at this line right here. And so when we include pond.inc, we get a data variable that has two elements in it, one element for the description and one for the commands. And what we're going to do is save this data to the locations variable. Again, this is the static variable, so we don't have to go through this process again. So the next time this function gets called and pond gets passed as the location, when we get to this spot here where we're checking to see if the location already exists in the locations variable, it will, and we'll skip to here where we just return that data. So instead of returning the data directly, what we do is save it in that locations variable and then return the locations variable. In this section, we could have returned the data array, but we can save one line of code by instead returning the item in this locations variable. So we were looking at the current location data function, which gets used in order to return some specific data associated with a particular location. In the case that we were looking at, the key here was description. And so for pond, for example, if we jump to the code inside of the pond.inc file, we would get this description here returned to us. I'm going to jump back to the file comparison tool. Before we move on, I wanted to point out that what we're doing here with this current location data and get location data is that we've split out something that could be a single function into two functions, one of which is more flexible, so it can be used in more situations. So this get location data can allow us to access information about other places at any given time, whereas current location data is specific to the location where the user currently is, or more specifically, what's in their session location variable. So again, like in some of our previous examples where we've looked at generalizing code, this can provide us with more flexibility as we begin to build features onto this game.